Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. I was a pizza delivery girl when I was young, and this night, I was delivering to a house I had never been to before. I went up to the front door, and nobody answered when I rang the bell. Nobody answered at all. And I returned to my car to take the pizza back and get my next delivery. At some point during my drive back, I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw a person sitting in my back seat. I swerved the car and hit another car that was parked. I stomped the brakes while screaming and got out of the car as quickly as I could. The person in the back seat started laughing at my fear, and I stopped the car to get help. The person in the back seat was very ill in the head, and they didn't try to hurt me when I was in the car. But when the police pulled them from my car, they had a small pocket knife clutched in their hand. I was in my 20s when I had the scariest dream of my life. I've had intense dreams, and even nightmares, but nothing has topped this, and I hope nothing ever does. I was dreaming about going to my dentist, and in the dream, I was talking to a lady at the front counter, when suddenly, I turn my head to my right, and there's another woman sitting right next to me, looking me in the eyes. Then, with a very serious look on her face, she says to me, "There is somebody in your apartment. Wake up." I jolted awake and was sweating bullets. My heart was throbbing, and I slowly checked my apartment. Nobody was there. 1 year ago, I was sitting at my grandpa's bedside as he was dying. I've been very close to this man my entire life, and I'm in my 30s now. As he's laying there, asleep, I'm on the phone, when he suddenly turns to me and says, "Daniel, I need to tell you something." I tell him okay, and he proceeds to tell me that he brutally murdered his first wife and her son. I'm in shock, and I ask him how and why, and he responds that he got angry, and that he used an old hammer from his garage. Hearing this completely blew my mind, because he was the kindest man I have ever known, or so I thought. He tells me they never found out it was him, and that he cleaned up the blood and got rid of all the evidence. I tried to act as normal as possible after hearing this, and I had to leave the room shortly after. I sat in the hospital hallway near his room and tried to think of what to do. I eventually went back into his room and asked him if anyone else knew about what he had done. He told me no, but he was ready to come clean, but that he didn't want to do it himself. He wanted me to tell everybody. I got upset and told him I couldn't, and that I wouldn't. He got very emotional after I said this, and began to cry. I left his hospital room again and drove home. 3 days later, my father called me and told me that he had passed away. I still hadn't told anybody, not even my wife. Months later, I was helping my father and my uncle clean out some things in my grandpa's garage, and hanging up over his tool bench was a very old-looking hammer. It brought chills up my spine. I told my father and my uncle that day, and it took some convincing and arguing, but they eventually believed me. My father went to the authorities with the information. It's a very strange feeling to miss a person you loved so much in your life, but equally hate them for what they left you with. I miss my grandpa, but he was the biggest coward I have ever known. I took the hammer to my house, and I look at it often, wondering if this was the hammer he used to murder his first wife and stepson. A few years ago, my ex-husband and I were meeting at the mall with my 2-year-old daughter. She was happily munching on a cookie and watching Yo Gabba Gabba on my phone. This old Japanese man, probably 70 years old, walked up to us and started commenting on how pretty she is. She has curly strawberry blonde hair and sea green eyes with super pale skin. He went on to say how she looks so healthy. I say thank you. Old people always love adorable kids, so I didn't freak out immediately. He then proceeds to stroke her cheek and run his hands through her hair and talks about how we should bring her to his office because he is a pediatrician and he would love to treat her. I pick her up from the high chair and hold her in my lap so he won't touch her again. My ex-husband tries to politely give cues for him to go away, but he doesn't take the hint. Then, while I'm holding her, he bends over and runs his hand over her leg and gives her this creepy smile and says, "It's okay. I'm a pediatrician." I scoot back, glaring as I say, "Don't touch my kid," and stand up to start putting her in her stroller. We leave and he follows us out to the car asking to play with her. A few weeks pass and I go back to the same mall and end up bumping into him again. This time, my ex-husband was at work, so I'm in Sephora and picking up some makeup and I have my back turned for a minute and I hear, "Mommy," and turn to see the old man holding my daughter. I get her back from him and loudly say, "Get the hell away from my child," and go to the mall security to tell them. They couldn't find him. After that, we never went back to that mall. I used to work at a place which required to be manned 24 hours a day. The reason being is that I handled sensitive documents and files, and if somebody needed this information in the middle of the night, I would have to fetch it for them or confirm that I have it. Security here is tight. There's bars on the windows, multiple locked doors to get to where I am. They would give me work to do during the night but underestimated how quickly I could get it done, so like most nights, I finished my work in like 30-45 minutes and pulled out my phone and played games. I browsed Netflix and Reddit since nobody else is in the building at night, so now it is getting to be the last third of my shift when all of a sudden, I hear a door close. I look to the security camera and see someone walking down the hall towards my room. At first, I thought it was just somebody that came in ridiculously early, so I turn around in my chair and wait for them to walk through the door, but nobody does and the hairs start to rise on my back. Now, this isn't a really big building, so I figure I'll find the guy wherever CV he is and start checking offices and storage rooms. But I came up empty-handed. However, I do see that a fire door had shut. I go to try to rewind the camera, but the digital recording is password protected and I don't have the password. The whole thing freaked me out. The way the person was walking down the hallway, like a determined walk, right to where I was. So, I sit with my spine tingling for the last couple hours of my shift and finally people start coming in. My replacement shows up and I tell her what I saw, and at this point, I figured I must have imagined the whole thing. I'm told to go home and the manager and girl who replaced me would look over the camera. After getting home, I call my manager and ask what was on the camera. So they said that the video showed the fire door closing, but then the video froze for about an hour. The next thing it records is me reopening the door. I used to nanny full-time. One night, the parents asked me to stay late, almost overnight, so they could go on a date. I put all the kids to bed and loaded up a movie the mom had suggested I watch. It was a horror movie called The Babadook. Part of the way through the movie, I paused it because I heard the youngest coming down the stairs. She comes up to me, looks me dead in the eyes and says, "Do you want to die?" Without hesitation, I told her no, go back to bed. As soon as I hit play, the little boy in the movie, about the same age as the girl that just walked up to me, asks the mother, "Do you want to die?" I thought it was freaky, but I chalked it up to her maybe seeing the movie already with her family. When her parents got home, I told her mother about it. She told me she has never seen the movie, and apparently she just does this sometimes while sleepwalking. I woke up in the middle of the night because my cat was crying at my bedroom door. He did this often when he would empty his water bowl to let me know that he needed more. It wasn't a problem for me until this one night. I got out of bed, and right outside my door, my cat was waiting. I stood in the doorway for a second and waited for him to turn and start walking away ahead of me. He did, and as I walked out of the hallway, I turned the corner to the left, and in my peripheral vision to my right, I saw somebody standing by my back door. I was so tired and out of it, I didn't even realize that I had actually just seen somebody in my house until I was in the kitchen. You can't even imagine how scary it is to see something like that. In books and movies, it is scary. In real life, it is something else entirely. I stood in the kitchen trembling and trying to think of what to do. I didn't want them to know that I did see them when I walked by. My eyes started to fill with tears. My husband was in bed asleep, and to reach him, I'd have to walk by the back door again. I was sure if I did that, something bad would happen, but I didn't know what else to do. Somehow, I don't know how, I made a decision. I would turn the corner and pretend to not see them again. I counted to 5 and started walking. When I turned the corner, I ran into a man standing in front of my bedroom door. I screamed and fell backwards. The man started grabbing at me, and my husband came out of the room. He wrapped his arms around the man and threw him away from me. I swear, my husband says he didn't hear anything, but I swear I heard the loud noise that sounded like an alarm right after he did that. Thankfully, my husband was able to overpower the man, and I ran and got my cell phone and called 911. The man was pinned to the ground the whole time and just kept saying, "I'll just leave, honey, I'll just leave." When the police finally arrived, I had the front door already open, and when they came inside, the crazy man started crying like a child, like uncontrollably. I have never really been the same since this happened. It was truly the stuff of nightmares. I had been delivering pizzas for about 3 years. I was 21 years old when this happened. I have no idea what night it was, but I remember it was late. We had an order placed for one small pizza. I drove out to this house that was located on a lonely dark road, with not too many lights on it, and not too many houses. The house looked nice, but was pitch black inside, no lights on at all. This happened several times during this job, but it always made me feel a little uneasy. Why would you be ordering pizza and have 0 lights on when the person is supposed to deliver it? I walked up to the porch and knocked. It seemed like nobody was home, which made no sense, but I was hoping nobody would answer so I could just leave. I knocked again, and got nothing. I didn't really care if these people got their pizza. I was getting creeped out standing on this dark porch, so I turned around to go back to my car. I stopped immediately when I noticed the guy standing in the middle of the walkway, holding some kind of object. I'm pretty sure it was a crowbar or something like that. I was about to say something, but I couldn't think of anything, and I quickly realized I was in danger. There would be no reason for this guy standing there blocking my path holding this thing, except to hurt me, or steal the money I had, or something. I put the pizza on the ledge next to the ashtray, and jumped over the side of the porch wall, and started running like a madman into the backyard. I heard the guy give chase, but I was in pretty good shape. I only weighed about 140 pounds, and I was pretty sure I could outrun this guy. I hopped the fence in the backyard that led into the neighbor's backyard, and then ran and hopped their fence to the left of me. After that, I hopped like 3 more fences before I ended up back onto some street. I started walking fast and out of breath over to the sidewalk. I pulled my phone out to call my boss. He thought I was joking at first, which really pissed me off. I told him to send somebody to get me right away. After hiding on the porch of another darkened house, a co-worker eventually picked me up. I got in his car, and the whole thing felt surreal. I couldn't believe that any of this just happened. We drove back over to the house, and my car was still sitting there on the dark street in front of this dark house. I told the guy who was driving I wasn't getting out to get it until we had police with us. We saw the guy sitting on the porch as we drove by, but he didn't have that object in his hands anymore. I saw him watch me as we drove by. We sped off, and I called the police. We met them there, and the guy was gone. The police knocked on the door a few times, and then eventually opened up the front door to reveal that the house was vacant, dark. There was nothing inside. This scared me so much. I got back in my car and went back to the pizza place. I only worked for this place a few more days before my family and my girlfriend convinced me it was time to get another job. Delivering pizza is dangerous work. A girl in my high school English class once told me a story. She was 4 years old at the time. She lived in a house backing onto a park with no fence around her backyard. She had a glass sliding door in her room that opened out to the park. It's the middle of the night, and she's asleep. She suddenly hears a banging at the door. Being a little kid, she hides under her blankets in fear. In the morning, there was a dead woman covered in blood outside the door. Blood was smeared down the glass. Apparently, she was attacked in the park, ran for help, and was trying to get someone in the house to help her. She ended up getting stabbed to death on the girl's back porch. This happened when I was 17. I was home alone, and I had gotten into the shower. I was washing my hair when I heard something in the bathroom. I still had shampoo in my hair, and I tried to open my eyes right away. The shampoo got in my eyes, and I was forced to close them. It sounded like somebody had opened the bathroom door, but I had locked it, so I wasn't sure. I frantically rinsed my hair while trying to open my eyes while doing it. As soon as I was able, I opened them completely. I could kind of see that the bathroom door was cracked open. A sudden rush of fear, I turned off the water and yelled out, "Mom," hoping to God that she would respond. She didn't, and I started shaking. I climbed out of the shower and wrapped my towel around my body. I always locked the bathroom door. Always. I opened the door, and to my horror, I could see all the way down the hall that the front door was wide open. My bedroom was right next to the bathroom, and I remember I moved into it very quickly and closed and locked my door. I had clothes on my bed, and I quickly got dressed. I tried to think of who to call first, when I heard a noise in my closet behind me. Petrified, I turned around and saw that my closet was closed, when I had always left it open. I didn't stick around to see who was in my closet. I ran out of the house and over to my friend's house, who lived a few doors down. Her dad answered the door, and I used their phone to call my mom, who then called the police. It was absolutely insane. 2 cops showed up at my house, but didn't find anyone. When they assured my mom and I that nobody was in the house, We went inside with them, and I saw that my closet was now open. My dad did live with us there, but he helped my mom buy a gun. We weren't allowed to get it right away, and we had to sleep in that house without one for a long time. It was so eerie, especially at night. Nothing happened again, but we didn't feel better or sleep better until finally she was able to pick up the gun. I have a story of the most frightening thing that has ever happened to me when I was 7 years old. I lived with just my mom after she left my dad. She started dating this nice man that lived on our street, and after I'd say about a month of dating him, he started to stay over at our house at night. He was a dentist and was really funny. He used to joke with me before I went to bed and say things like, "Did you make sure the monster under your bed isn't there tonight? And if he is, just let me know, and I'll beat him up good for you." Well, being the young girl I was, I would sometimes check under my bed just to make sure. One night, he said what he normally said to me, but I responded with, "There are no monsters, and I've checked under my bed, but no monsters were ever there." I told him monsters weren't real. He then looked at me and said, "They are real, and he has seen them, and I need to be careful." That night, I woke up to noises coming from underneath my bed. I was horrified, of course, and I laid there just listening to them. I was too afraid to check under there. The next day, I told him I heard something under my bed, and he told me something along the lines of, "I told you so." That following night, I woke up to the same noises, but this time, I somehow had the courage to look. I stood up on my bed and jumped to my bedroom door and turned the light on. I kneeled down and looked under the bed. My mom's new boyfriend, the dentist, was under my bed smiling at me. He started to say something, but I ran to my mom's room and woke her up. She was very confused, and after that night, I never saw that weirdo again. My brother has told this story many times. When he was about 13 or 14, he was getting to sleep one night. The lights were off. His door was closed. He was falling asleep. All of a sudden, he gets a feeling that he's being watched by someone. The feeling becomes stronger and stronger, so he pulls the covers over his head, curls into a ball, trying not to freak out. He even starts saying the "Our Father, who art in heaven" prayer when a few lines in, he hears a voice right next to him say, "That's not going to help you." He stayed under the covers, shivering with fright. Hello, everyone. I have a very creepy story to share with you all. It happened in my own house about 3.5 years ago. I've been divorced for about 10 years now, and this happened one night when my kids were at my house. I was asleep in bed when I heard a noise. The noise was very startling. It sounded like cabinets in my kitchen were being slammed repeatedly. I'll be honest, I was afraid to go check what it was, because I've never heard something like this before in the middle of the night. But my kids were there, and I had to see what it was as fast as possible. When I went out into my kitchen, the noise stopped, but the cabinet door to my pantry was open, which it was never left open. I looked around my house and checked on my kids, but they were both still in bed. My son was awake and had heard the noise too, but my daughter slept through it. I didn't find anyone or any explanation for the noise. I returned to bed and didn't hear anything again that night. The very next night, I was awakened again. The same exact noise, and when I checked it, I came up with nothing once more. Once again, my son had heard it, but my daughter was asleep when I checked on her. I went back to bed and laid there awake and confused for hours. I felt very nervous and scared about what that noise was. The next night, I found out what was making that noise. I was dead asleep when suddenly, right next to my bed, my closet door began violently slamming repeatedly. I jolted awake and turned over to see my daughter standing at the closet, slamming the door over and over. I felt terrified as I saw that she was looking at me and grinning. I jumped out of bed and stopped the door. I looked into her eyes and she looked like she was not there. She was sleepwalking. The next day, she told me she had no idea anything had happened. What's really unusual is that it never happened again, and as far as I know, she had never walked around in her sleep again. I had fallen asleep on the bed in my work clothes. It had been a really long day. When I awoke, it was dark. I was delirious. I sat up and kicked off my shoes. Just then, I heard the baby on the baby monitor. I picked it up and heard my wife humming. I smiled. She then whispered, "Go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep." My smile faded as I turned and saw my wife asleep in our bed. I ran to the baby's room and she was crying. The window was wide open and the screen was laying outside on the grass. It was the most terrifying thing you could imagine. I met my ex-girlfriend in California in 2010. We had both lived there our whole lives, but decided to move to Maine a couple years after we started dating. She had flown to Maine on a business trip in 2012 and fell in love with everything about it. The small towns, the scenery, and the people. She came home and convinced me to pack up our lives and move there, so we did. We saved up a bunch of money and rented a huge moving truck. The plan was for me to drive the truck across the country while she stayed behind 3 days to finish her classes at the local community college, which were due to end at that time. I would have just waited until her classes were finished, but we decided to take advantage of an incredibly good deal we were offered from the company who provided the moving truck. She had a car she had to drive there anyways, while I towed my car behind the moving truck. My brother came with me on the trip. The drive was obviously a very long one, and when my brother and I arrived in Maine about 4 days after we had left, we were exhausted. After unloading the truck and sleeping for about 16 hours, we decided to visit the small town of Belfast, which was 14 miles away from my new house. We ate some seafood at a little family-owned joint, rented a scary movie, and made the drive back. My new house was literally in the middle of nowhere. During the day, the view of the lake in my backyard was amazing. The woods surrounding my house were awesome, and everything was beautiful. At night, the house was incredibly creepy to be in. The whole house had windows completely surrounding it. You could not see anything looking out those windows at night, but I'm sure if you were standing outside, you could quite easily see in. My brother had a flight booked back to California the following day, and we woke up very early in the morning to drive to Portland, where the airport was. I eventually made it back, alone, and wasn't able to make any phone calls or watch any cable TV, because we had no service out there and no cable or internet hooked up yet. My cell phone did not work anywhere on that property. I had plenty of DVD to watch, and that was it. When I made it back, I decided to try out my new fishing pole we had just bought in town. I was out at the lake very long, as it started to get dark in Maine very quickly in autumn. I went back to the house and sat in the living room in a chair, looking out the windows at the scenery. My view was getting darker and darker. I turned on all the lights in the house, and quickly became creeped out when it became pitch black outside. Imagine being in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and looking around. You could not see your own hand if you held it in front of your face. When I say it was pitch black, I mean you can't see anything. I hadn't hung up any curtains or blinds yet, and I had the extremely uneasy feeling that somebody was outside my house, watching me inside, watching me go from room to room. And if they were out there, they could easily do just that. I decided to hang sheets up over all the windows using thumbtacks. I sat on the couch in the living room and put on a comedy movie to try and shake the unnerving feeling I had. It did not work. I eventually realized I had to try to get some sleep. I had a lot of work to do the next day, and my eyelids were becoming sore. I was getting very tired. I covered myself with blankets on the couch and turned off the TV. After a few minutes, my eyes had adjusted and I could see around the living room very slightly. My eyes were very heavy and I fell asleep. I woke up some time later and it was still night and still dark. I reached for my bottle of Coke I had on the ground in front of me and took a big gulp. I set it back down and looked around the room. Now, I'm having difficulty putting these next emotions into words that I could accurately convey to you. My heart began throbbing when I noticed the man standing in the corner of the room. He was staring at me. I felt as if I was going to die from fright. I did nothing, and said nothing, not by choice, but because I couldn't. I was frozen. He didn't move, and I wasn't able to think logically for a moment. I'm not sure he knew I had seen him or was looking at him. I had a blanket over me, which might have shrouded my face in shadow, in which he wouldn't be able to see my eyes. After about a minute of gut-wrenching fear, I somehow decided to do something. This was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. I coughed, but it wasn't a real cough. I did it while getting up, in an effort to give him the impression I did not know he was there. I slowly made it to my feet, and walked across the icy cold wood flooring to the bathroom around the corner of the living room. He didn't move. I made it to the bathroom, and nothing happened. I closed the bathroom door, and slowly turned the lock to the upright position. Tears went down my face as I backed up into the bathtub behind me. I was staring at the door. I suddenly realized there was a small window up above the bathtub that I could most likely crawl through. I moved by the shower curtain and reached up to the window. I unlocked it and tried sliding it to the left to open it. The window began to squeak when I pulled it, and I froze, hoping the man didn't hear. Just then, I heard a tapping on the bathroom door. Not a knock, but a tap, and it didn't sound like the tap of fingers. It sounded like metal, like he was tapping a knife against the door. At this point, I made the realization that the man either knew what I was doing, or simply wanted me to know he was outside the door. Adrenaline took over completely, and I slid the window open and pushed the screen out onto the ground. I tried not to exert any noise as I jumped up and began squeezing my body through the window. My head and upper body were out, and I could not see inside the bathroom. Only the dense, dark woods in front of me. I was pulling my legs through the window when I felt the man grab my foot. Directly after that, before I could react, I felt my ankle be sliced open. I let out a noise of shock and surprise as I pulled out of his grasp and fell to the ground. I started heaving, and I felt as if my heart would explode. I stood up and looked around. I very quickly dashed out into the woods and fell to the ground, looking back at the house and the window to the bathroom. I felt down my leg to my ankle, which was throbbing from pain, and brought my hand up to reveal it covered in blood. The deathly serious situation I was in became real and horrifying. I looked back at the house and suddenly saw the back door fly open, and the man started gazing around the darkness surrounding me. He was searching for me. I became a statue on the ground and tried to control my breathing. He had a huge hunting knife in his right hand and was wearing all black. He walked down the back patio steps and started walking into the woods, but not near where I was laying. He was grunting, and soon after, I lost sight of him. I started frantically looking around, thinking he would at any moment spot me and stab me to death. I saw nothing but trees and darkness. There was a bit of snow on the ground from a couple days before, and I was freezing and shaking at this point uncontrollably. About 10 minutes later, I saw the man walk out of the trees from where he entered and go back into the house. I laid out there the rest of the night, and luckily, the sun started to rise only about an hour later. After the sun fully illuminated my surroundings, I felt as though the man had probably left, and I felt ready to move again. I arose to my feet and walked around the house to the front. I saw that the front door was open completely. I slowly approached it and peered inside. Nothing. I walked in a few steps and very gently grabbed my car keys that were hanging on a hook by the door. I ran back to my car and unlocked it. I got inside and started the engine. I backed out of the long driveway and drove to the little general store a few miles from my house. This is where the story ends. I got away, and so did my visitor. My ankle was pretty badly cut, but healed after a few months with no problems. I suffered minor pneumonia from being outside for the time I had, but nothing too serious became of it. I later found out that an elderly man that lived about 2 miles down the road from me was murdered in his bedroom in the middle of the night. This experience took its toll on mine and my girlfriend's relationship, and I ended up moving back to California after a few months. The incident has made sleep very difficult to achieve, but writing this has oddly enough made me somewhat drowsy. I think maybe I'll attempt to go to sleep right now. Thanks for listening. Something very creepy happened to me on Christmas. I had celebrated the holiday that morning with my family and went to see my parents. On Christmas night, I had to go into work to finish a proposal I was working on for a new potential client. I obviously didn't want to go into work, but it had to be finished. I worked in a building downtown that is fairly close to a few nightclubs and bars. My office is on the 23rd floor, and in my position, I have an office, but most of this floor is filled up with cubicles in the middle. My office is in the far corner next to my boss's, so to get to my office I have to walk by all the cubicles. I didn't get there late, probably around 8 or 9, but there was nobody else there. This was my second time going in alone, and it was peaceful. If I let my imagination run wild, however, I would get spooked easily. As I walked the path next to the cubicles, I was reminded of what I was missing at home while looking at all the Christmas lights strung up, decorating people's workspaces. There were no lights on, but it was lit up enough by all these Christmas lights. I reached my office and unlocked it. I went inside but didn't close the door. My computer and desk faced away from my door, so I couldn't see anyone that approached my door on work days through the huge glass window that I had. I found this very annoying, as I never knew who was knocking until I got up and opened the door. I sat down and began working as quickly as possible so I could get back home. After a while, I'd say about an hour into it, I heard the main entrance door close. I didn't hear it open, but when it closed, it made a noise that was unmistakable. I wasn't spooked at this point, just curious as to who else was unlucky enough to have to come in and finish something. I got up from my desk and walked out onto the floor. I looked around, but didn't see anybody. I said loudly, "Hello." Nobody responded. At this moment I got paranoid and freaked out, because I definitely heard the main entrance door close. Somebody was either here and then left, or was still in here with me and not responding. I was just about to turn around and get back to work and brush it off, when I saw a head sticking up out of a cubicle on the opposite side of the floor. Looking at me, I could see that it was a man, but couldn't make out any details of his face. I thought he must be messing with me, so I shouted over to him, "What a time to have to come in, eh?" Hoping whoever it was would stand up and laugh, but they didn't. The man didn't move, and this scared the shit out of me, so I tried again. I said, "I can see you, guy." He didn't move. I wasn't sure what to do next, and was scared shitless by now, so I felt through my pocket for my keys, and they were there. I started walking down the path toward the entrance door, the whole time watching this guy. As I was walking, I think he was watching me. I looked over at the entrance door for a second, just one damn second, and looked back. He was gone. After seeing this, I thought, oh my God, he could be moving over to me, so I jogged the rest of the way to the door, and went through it. I jogged over to the elevator and hit the button. I turned around quickly, and the entrance door closed as it made the same noise as before. The elevator door, thankfully, opened immediately, and I went inside and hit the first floor button. The door closed, and I didn't see the guy come out the entrance door. I drove home and told my wife what happened. I had to call my boss and tell him as well, so I had a reason for not finishing my proposal that night. He was understanding, and I went back in 2 days later with everyone else. I never found out who that guy was, or what that was all about. Nothing was stolen or tampered with, to my knowledge. I started work as a mailman a few months ago, and just last week, I had an extremely bad experience. There's this one house. Every time I deliver there, I see a person watch me through their front window, and I mean every time. I had always chalked this up to be an elderly person who had nothing better to do, and after a while of it happening, it didn't freak me out as much. One day though, I had to finish delivering mail on another carrier's route that had an emergency and had to stop early. When I was finished with theirs, I had to finish my own. As I made it to this one particular house, where the person watched me every day, I saw that they were not there at the window. This kinda made me happy, but also creeped me out, because it meant that the person always knew about what time I would normally be there and specifically looked out the window at that time. I dropped the mail into their slot and continued on. I had 3 more houses before I had to return to my truck to grab all the mail for the next street. When I got back to the truck, I saw a weird-looking lady standing under the street light behind it. She looked like she was on drugs. Her hair was a mess, and she was wearing gray sweat clothes, stains all over them. She smiled at me and was missing teeth. She then said hello. I said it back and started gathering the mail for the next street. I couldn't see her as I did this, and I felt like she was walking up behind me. I turned around and she was indeed closer than before, standing in the street. I asked her if she needed something and she said, "No, I don't." I said back, "Okay, well, I'm gonna continue on. Have a good day." With all the mail ready to go, I closed the back door, made sure it was all locked up, and started walking. I felt relieved to be walking away from this crazy-looking woman. I delivered to about 6 houses when I noticed the woman standing next to a truck in the shadows. She was following me. I'm sure she thought I couldn't see her there. I continued on, and after every other house, I saw that she was keeping up with me and trying to hide. This was so damn scary. There was nobody else around, and I felt like she would attack me at any moment. I delivered the mail to another house, and sure enough, when I walked back to the sidewalk, I could see her standing in a shadow by a big tree across the street. I decided I could not continue my night like this and walked over to her. She stiffened up when I approached her, and I said, "Why are you following me?" She didn't respond, and instead made my heart sink as she let out a noise only a crazy person would make. A noise like she was scared of me, but it sounded insane. She then ran away. She was definitely on something, and the next day when I came to that house where I would always see somebody there watching me through the window, she was there. I know it was her. I was sound asleep, and at around 6 a.m., I was woken up by my 5-year-old daughter's face inches from mine. She looked right into my eyes and whispered to me, "I want to peel all your skin off." I thought I was dreaming at first. After a moment or two, I realized I wasn't, and I was genuinely very freaked out. I had no idea what to do or say to her. I got out of bed and walked her back to her bedroom. She's 8 years old now, and nothing like that has happened again. It made my blood run cold. I asked her why she said that to me that night, and I've asked her a couple times since, and she said she was upset with me that I didn't let her have dessert after she got in trouble earlier that night. When I was a kid, I met a psychopath. Not an adult psycho, a kid the same age as me. He lived right next to me. We lived in the country, and I still do now. I've always loved living out here, so much freedom and peace and quiet. When I was a kid, exploring the farms nearby and down the old roads was the thing to do. When I first met this crazy little boy, I was 10, as was he. You couldn't really tell there was something wrong with him when you were just talking to him or meeting him for the first time. However, I quickly learned how he really was when we went off to play. He would insist upon chasing chickens, which was fine, I guess. Not really my idea of fun. I'd much rather build a treehouse or go exploring, like I said. I chased chickens with this kid, but when one time he caught the chicken is when I realized I wanted nothing to do with him. He butchered it. I was so shocked to see him grab a small hatchet and do this. I acted like it was fine, but when I got home, I told my mom and dad, and they told me to just stay away from him, and they would try to speak with his parent, which from what I saw at the time was an alcoholic mother that paid very little attention to him or what he did. I wish I could say the story ends there, but yeah, it doesn't. Unfortunately, I wound up hanging out with this kid a few more times, and one of those times, my cousin had come over to spend the night, and the next day we were running and playing around the farm. I think we found rope in the barn, some old rope about 5 feet long. We thought it would be fun to tie each other up in the barn, and the kid that was tied up would try to escape from the ties and then commence finding the other kid. A version of hide and go seek, if you will. I was tied up first. My cousin disappeared, and very shortly after, the weird demented kid appeared. I was still tied. Thinking back on it now, I'm pretty sure he was spying on us and saw that I was alone and tied up. He came up to me with a very sinister smile on his face, like he knew he could do anything he wanted, and I was helpless. He walked up to me, knelt down to my face, and said, "I'm taking you to the fucking hellhole." I didn't say anything back to that, because of how scary it was. He then grabbed my face with his hands, and threw my head to the ground. It's silly, but I felt like this kid was going to kill me. I told him it really hurt and to stop. My cousin appeared again, and the kid acted like we were all friends and asked if he could play. I told him hell no and to leave us alone. My cousin was confused, but I told him later about the kid. The last time I came into contact with this kid was weeks later, and it was at the same barn. I was alone and just walking around exploring. I walked to the back of the barn, where there were very old metal bars laying around everywhere, as well as old farming equipment. I saw some bright blue sneakers sticking out behind an old tractor, and my curiosity led me to see what was happening behind it. When I got to the back of the tractor, I was extremely startled to see the kid sitting down on the ground with 2 dead chickens next to him, and he was smearing their blood on his face like war paint. I said nothing and was gone in an instant. I didn't really have the desire to explore around my house anymore, and thank God my mom and dad bought a house far away from there only months later. I have no idea what became of that kid, but I'm sure he's in a padded room somewhere. This happened 2 years ago on our anniversary. My wife and I were celebrating 3 years married, and we decided to both take the day off work and go for a drive down to the beach. It was a bit of a drive, about 3 hours one way. The drive was amazing. We had fantastic conversation and enjoyed all the sights on the way out there. When we arrived, there was only a few hours left of daytime, but we didn't mind. We kind of liked the idea of walking along the sand at night to gaze at the stars and listen to the ocean peacefully without the usual noise that comes with visiting the beach. We ate dinner at a nice steakhouse right on the water, and when we finished, we decided it was time to hit the beach, finally. From the restaurant, we walked to our car, which was parked in the lot right next to the beach entrance. My wife grabbed a sweater and a blanket, while I grabbed a 6-pack and a small cooler I had brought. We headed towards the sand and went through a very old wooden fence with an opening cut out. We walked out towards the water and marveled at the sight of it, and the moon lighting our way beautifully. We stopped and chose a nice spot about 30 yards away from the waves crashing against the sand, and about 70 yards, I'd say, from the wooden fence leading back to our car, and the small seaside town that we were in. We unfolded the blanket and sat down on top of it. After a few minutes of talking, kissing, and drinking, we laid down. We were truly amazed by all the stars in the sky, and it was a gorgeous sight. I'd say about 15 minutes later, I felt a presence. I was still watching the stars, but I felt like there was somebody watching us. I sat up and noticed my wife had drifted off and fell asleep. I looked around the beach and saw nothing. It was complete serenity. Then I turned completely around, and this is when my heart stopped. About 15 feet away from us, a man was sitting behind us in the sand. This caught me completely off guard and scared the shit out of me, mainly because he didn't speak when he noticed that I had seen him. He sat in the sand, very close to us, with a giant smile on his face. A giant, extremely creepy smile. I was in shock to see this, and at first, was not even able to speak. I glanced at my wife again, who was completely asleep. At that moment, I'm not sure why, but I felt like our lives were in very real danger. I looked up, and the man reacted. His smile disappeared and turned into an angry look. He then pulled out a huge knife from underneath him. I shook my wife awake and said at the same time, "What the fuck are you doing? Are you serious?" In a scared, but firm voice, my wife regained her focus and spun around to look at the man. At that moment, he smiled again. His giant smile made me shiver, and my wife gasped when she saw he had a knife and didn't say a word. He didn't respond to me, and instead, stood up. He clutched a very big, what looked like a kitchen knife, and took a single step towards us. My wife gasped again. I forced myself to do something. I stood up as well and said, "What do you want? You can have our phones and our keys, but I have no cash, man." The man looked completely insane, which was absolutely terrifying. He wore a brown suit, all ripped up. It looked like it came out of a trash can. His long brown hair was a mess, and he looked homeless. Once again, he didn't reply to me. After about 15 seconds of unnerving silence, he did something. He ran up to us very quickly, and my wife screamed. I almost had a heart attack. He stopped before he stepped foot onto our blanket, and once again, his smile turned into a crazy and angry-looking frown. I spoke one last time. "Dude, you can have everything. Just be cool, man. You can have a beer." My voice was cracking. I was petrified. I tried to humanize this guy and make him feel almost welcome to our stuff. Like what he was doing, like his knife, wasn't a big deal. He then spoke to us. He said in a normal, sane voice, "I don't drink." Then he turned around and started walking away from us. Relief hit me like a ton of bricks. I kneeled down and grasped my wife's shoulder. He continued walking away, and then he stopped and turned around again. He didn't look at us, but instead looked up at the sky. Then he turned around once more and made his way through the fence and disappeared into town. My wife started tearing up, and I said, "Let's go." We very quickly grabbed our belongings and started walking down the beach quickly towards a different entrance leading to a parking lot next to the one our car was parked. After circling around the huge parking lot, walking around the restaurant we ate at, we saw people laughing and talking outside. They had no idea what we just experienced. We approached our car. We got inside, and we drove away. We were pretty much silent on the way back home. My wife just hung her head out of the window. We haven't visited the beach since then. Hello, I have a story to tell you. This happened to me about 15 years ago. I lived near the ocean, and I frequented a certain spot on the beach all the time. It was a lonely spot, and not many people ever really showed up there. This one Saturday afternoon, as I recall, I was laying out in the sand, in my spot, relaxing and tanning. It's not uncommon for me to fall asleep doing this, as I sometimes did, if the sun wasn't too hot on my skin. This one particular day, I did. I woke up a while later, to the sun now setting, and realized I had slept for quite a while. I looked to my left, and saw a woman sitting near me in the sand, but not on a towel. She was wearing jean shorts and a bathing suit top. She had very pretty red hair. At first, I didn't really acknowledge her. There were a couple other people around, but after glancing at her a few times, I noticed she was just staring out into the ocean and didn't turn to look at me, or anybody else, or anything for that matter. I felt a bit of curiosity and said hello to her. She said hello back without hesitating, without turning her head to look at me. Right after that, She sprung to her feet and walked away. I thought it was weird, but I didn't really think anything of it. I'd say about 30 minutes later, I packed up my stuff and I left. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I had a great day relaxing there. Once I was home, I started making myself dinner. I heard my phone ring and walked over to my purse on the counter and pulled it out. It was my mom. We started talking about usual things when I noticed a square, folded piece of paper sticking out of my purse in the midst of our conversation. My mom continued talking, and I pulled it out and unfolded it, confused, because I was pretty sure I did not put it in there. I literally dropped the phone when I read what was written. The note said, "I was going to rob you and stab you in the throat, but you just look too peaceful." I picked up the phone and told my mom what happened, remembering the girl on the beach. We both nearly passed out. Halloween 2015. Halloween night started with myself and my buddy getting ready, putting on our costumes at my buddy's house. For the sake of privacy, I will refer to him as Brad. Brad and I were invited to a party by the girl he was dating. I was going dressed as a dead construction worker, while Brad dressed up as Maverick from Top Gun. We both looked pretty dumb, as we didn't put much effort into our costumes. He was excited about seeing the girl he had just started dating, and I was equally excited to see and flirt with some chicks that night. Once we were both ready to go, we headed out. Brad's new girl sent us a text with the address attached, and we GPS it. Brad drove us both to the party, which was about 30 miles away, on the outskirts of our city, out in the country. We drove down a very long, dark street, with no street lamps, and eventually made it to the house. The house was at the end of a long driveway, and when we pulled up, we saw a good number of cars and trucks parked out front. I'd say about 20. We were both pretty psyched, as this party looked to be awesome. Music was blaring from inside. The outside of the house was lit up with black lights and decorated with Halloween stuff, and red light was pouring out of the windows from inside. This place was a 2-story. It was very nice. It was surrounded by acres of farmland. There was not another house in sight. When we went inside, we found Brad's girl sitting on a couch in the living room, talking to 2 other people. We sat down, and Brad's girl said hello and came over to us, sitting next to Brad. She was dressed as a vampire. The 2 people she was talking to were wearing masks, one of them a guy, the other a girl. The girl was wearing a ghost face mask, and the guy was wearing just a mask with normal clothes. His mask was one of those black, blank face masks. We all talked for a while, with people rushing around us, dancing, and getting hammered. The guy was quiet. He only spoke when somebody spoke to him. I thought he was a little weird and creepy, and it didn't seem like he was having much fun. We assumed that the 2 had come together, but found out that the ghost face girl had come with 2 other girls, and the guy said he had come with his friend but couldn't find him now. After a couple hours of talking, laughing, and drinking, my vision was starting to get blurry, and I was getting pretty damn drunk. Brad and his girl had gotten off the couch and walked off somewhere, and the other 2 were still talking to each other on the couch next to me. They seemed to be flirting and having fun. At this point, I was people watching and sipping on my 5th mixed drink, Jack and Coke. I noticed that the blank face guy kept leaning his head back, and I'm pretty sure he was looking upstairs at the bedroom doors. I couldn't tell, because with his mask I couldn't see his eyes. The ghost face girl didn't seem to notice this. She was all over him and talking his ear off. At some point, I positioned one of the couch pillows behind my head and started to drift off to sleep. Going in and out of consciousness, I woke up for a moment completely and looked around the room. Shit was spinning at this point, and there was less people walking around. Way less. I pulled my phone out and checked the time. It was 3:45 a.m. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and leaned my head back on the pillow. I started closing my eyes, but right before I did, I noticed that the blank face guy was now leading the ghost face girl up the stairs. Her head was down, and she looked like she was barely awake and drunk as hell. He was helping her walk up the steps, and then they disappeared into a bedroom. The next thing I knew, Brad was shaking me and telling me that he wanted to leave. I asked if he was cool to drive, and he assured me he was. I got to my feet, and the room spun. I felt like I was going to puke right there, but I managed to make it outside. The sun had just gone up when we made it back to Brad's house, and we both collapsed on his couches and passed out. Hours later, I awoke to Brad's sister waking him up and questioning him. She asked if we had gone to that party out in the country, and he said yes. She was frantic and said that somebody was killed there last night. I was now completely awake upon hearing this, and so was Brad. I sat there silent, and Brad was asking who it was, what had happened. His sister said that she didn't know the girl's name yet, but that she was found murdered in an upstairs bedroom. She had been stabbed. I thought to myself, no way, sure enough to my disbelief. Later on that day, they showed the girl that was killed, and it was the ghost face girl. She was stabbed 36 times. The police questioned everybody who was at the party on Halloween, including Brad and I. Of course, I was very quick to tell them about the guy that brought her upstairs, and that he was wearing blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and a black blank face mask. To my knowledge, they never found that guy, and the person who threw the party said she never invited or saw the guy wearing a black blank face mask. So this happened to my family in early 2002, when my daughter was a baby. My wife and I moved into a new house right after our daughter was born. It was a nice place in the suburbs. I would rather not mention in what city. The house was relatively new, and surrounded by mother houses with the same exact design and layout. We were still getting used to our new life there, when one night, we heard the baby crying on the baby monitor. We were watching a movie in the living room, paused it, and went into the baby's room. The baby wanted her bottle. I stood in the doorway of the room while my wife tended to our newborn. I was smiling at the sight of this, when suddenly my wife made a small sound of fear and surprise. She was looking out the window directly beside the crib. I walked over to her, and she didn't say anything. I looked outside and saw a woman that looked to be our age, standing on our lawn and looking into the bedroom window. I went into protective mode and immediately walked out of the room and towards the front door, with the intention of confronting her. My wife shouted before I could open the door. Oh my God, she ran away. I ripped the door open and walked outside. I looked around the front of our house and walked a bit further onto the street, looking in both directions. No sign of her. I decided to walk around my whole house to make sure this creepy lady had left. I walked the perimeter of our house and didn't find her. I came back inside the house to find my wife still holding the baby in our master bedroom and told her I hadn't seen her. After a little while of being creeped out and looking out the windows to make sure she wasn't still lingering around, we decided she was gone for good and went to sleep. The next day, we saw the woman again. This time, at night. And this time, my wife was in the shower and I was holding our baby in her bedroom. I saw the woman standing in the same spot on our lawn, peering into the bedroom at me holding my baby. I just looked at her for the longest time and she didn't move. My wife eventually walked into the room with a towel in her hair and approached me from behind, giving me a hug. I said, "She's back. Look, the crazy bitch is just standing there looking at me." My wife got incredibly creeped out at this point and insisted that we call the police. I was going to, but felt I wanted to confront her again. So I walked out of the room and opened up the front door, which was only about 10 feet away from the baby's room. I walked outside and the woman was still there. She turned to me. I walked out onto our lawn, about 20 feet away from her, and said, "What the fuck are you doing? If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the cops, and if I ever see you around here again, I will call them immediately." The woman smiled at me and then opened her mouth wide and let out a nightmare-inducing scream that sounded as if she was in pain. I knew right away that this woman was ill, like in the head. She turned around and ran away. This was terrifying as I realized she was barefoot. She ran away like a little kid would, arms flailing. I went inside and my wife was already holding the phone. I agreed with her that we should call anyways, and we did. A couple police officers came by the house a short while later, and they said there was really nothing they could do except drive around the neighborhood a few times and keep an eye out for her. They said they would call us if they saw her. About 20 minutes after they left, they called and said they didn't see anyone fitting her description. We were disappointed but eventually went to sleep after taking turns looking out the windows for hours. I had assumed the woman got the hint. A month had passed with no sign of her. Then one night my wife and I were in bed when I heard a noise. I awoke and glanced at the alarm clock. It read 3:48 a.m. I listened for the noise to continue and heard giggling coming from the baby monitor. I sat up in bed and my heart stopped. I flew out of the room and into my baby's room to see nothing. My baby was asleep and my wife had followed me. I was very confused for a moment and thought I didn't actually hear anything. Maybe it was a nightmare. My wife asked what was wrong. I didn't respond for a few seconds and then finally said nothing. I thought I heard something. We both sighed and walked back to our room. My wife went into the room first and upon entering screamed and then threw herself backwards into me. I gasped and almost fell backwards onto the floor. My wife started repeating, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." My heart pounding, I replied, What? I forced my way past her and walked into my bedroom. The woman was sitting Indian style on our bed. I backed up out of the room and slammed the door. My wife ran and took our baby from her crib and the three of us went outside. As I was closing the front door once we had walked out, I heard our master bedroom door open. Neither of us had our cell phones on us, so we ran to our neighbor's house and started frantically knocking on their front door. They answered very quickly and asked what was the matter. We explained, and they ushered us inside and called the police. The cops showed up minutes later, and they went inside our house. The woman was still in there. They said they found her upstairs, sitting in the middle of the hallway in the dark. This happened at my house when I was about 11 years old. This one day, I believe I was playing video games when I heard a knock at the door. My parents were in their room talking, and I ran to the door looking through the window next to it to see who it was. It was a police officer. I thought that was kind of cool, not realizing something could be wrong, and opened up. We had a metal screen that was locked. The police officer first said, "Hi there. Are your parents home?" I told him yes. He responded with, "Are you sure? There aren't any cars in the driveway or out front. Can you open the screen so I can talk to you?" I said back, yeah, they are here. Their cars are parked in the garage. 1 second. I then yelled out, "Dad." And my dad replied, "What?" I walked over to their bedroom door and told them a policeman was at the door. My dad looked concerned and got up. He walked over to the front door and the police officer was now gone. My dad looked at me confused and said, "A cop was at the door." He then unlocked the screen and walked outside. I stayed in the house and my dad walked back in a few seconds later. "What did he say?" "Are you sure it was a cop?" I replied, "Yeah, he was wearing the outfit." He asked if you or Mom were here." My dad shrugged and said, "Weird." He didn't say anything else. "Did he say something was wrong?" I shook my head no, but I went to the couch and resumed my video game. A few days later another police officer came to our house, this time. My dad answered. The cop said to my dad, "Hello sir, sorry to bother you, but we've had some calls from people on this street claiming a man came to their door, dressed as a police officer. Did he by any chance come by your house?" My dad told them what happened a few days previous, and then the cops hit my dad with a bombshell. They said that the man was not a cop at all, but a man pretending to be one, trying to locate children who were home alone. I have a story I'd like to tell you all. This happened when I was 18, about 16 years ago. I was still living with my parents in their nice house in Colorado. It was getting late one night, around 1130. I was on the phone with my girlfriend, and had decided to go up to my room and switch phones, using the one that was in my room so I didn't wake my parents that I assumed were now in bed. Voices downstairs echoed upstairs easily, and I had gotten in trouble for that a few times before. I told my girlfriend to hang on, that I was going to put the phone down for a minute while I went upstairs to turn on my phone. I set the phone down on the counter, right next to where it hangs up on the wall. I quickly walked upstairs and into my bedroom. My room was cold. I left the window open. I slammed my window shut and picked up the phone next to my bed. "All right, babe, 1 sec. I'm gonna go downstairs real fast and hang up the living room phone." I sat the phone down on my bed and went downstairs. I reached the last step, turned left, and stopped. The phone was now hung up on the wall. I stood there for about 30 seconds, bewildered, a bit creeped out, and a bit confused. Maybe my parents came down and hung it up. No, that wasn't possible. I would have heard them, and I was only upstairs for about 30 seconds. I walked over to the phone, and then turned around, looking around the living room and into the kitchen. Nothing. No sign of my parents. Nobody else was in my house that night. I convinced myself that I must have hung it up before I went upstairs. Wait. No. That's not possible. Then I would have hung up on my girlfriend. I walked into the dining room, and nobody was there. I walked back upstairs and over to my parents' bedroom. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could hear my dad snoring. What the hell? I walked into my bedroom and almost had a heart attack when I saw that my bedroom phone was now hung up. I turned around fast to the dark hallway. Nobody. I ran downstairs into my horror. I saw the phone in the living room was gone. I got goosebumps all over my body, and my heart was now pounding out of my chest. I ran back upstairs and into my room. I ripped open my closet, but nobody was there. I walked over to my phone and picked it up. As soon as I did this, I heard somebody say, "I came in through your bedroom window." I almost dropped the phone out of fright and thought, what the fuck? That's not possible. My bedroom is on the second story. I turned around again expecting to see someone, but did not. I turned and opened my window. I looked out and saw a large extension ladder there leaning on my house just below the bottom of my window. I dropped the phone on the ground and ran to my parents' room. I slammed against their door with my fists and yelled, "Open the door. There is somebody in the house." My mom opened up and was confused with a terrified look on her face. I went into their room and my dad was sitting up in bed. I locked their bedroom door and repeated myself, "There is someone in here. They have the phone. They just said something to me." My mom ran to my dad's side of the bed and grabbed his work cell phone that was still in his jeans pocket. She called the police and they were at our front door knocking about 15 minutes later. They searched the house and found no one. They did find the living room phone though. It was laying in the middle of the grass in our backyard. Call centers can be a weird place to work. You talk to people from all over the country and even sometimes all over the world. Most people are a little more, well, frustrated than anything. The same questions every day eventually will drive you a little batty. I just wish those calls were the worst ones I'd ever get. I got the job as a customer service rep for a cable company just after I finished college. The hours sucked. 3 in the afternoon to midnight. It wasn't great, but the money was good and there were some medical benefits. It wasn't great, but with loans to pay, I took the first full-time job that came along. While some people need help with their cable after 10 p.m., there aren't many of them. 5 days a week, I was stuck at my desk taking calls from old men having trouble accessing Skinflix until midnight. Most of the night was spent gossiping with one other late-night employee, but the calls never stopped for too long. It was the middle of spring when I got the first weird call. At first, he sounded like the regular confused customer who was having trouble accessing some of the more mature channels. A little heavy breathing and a little stuttering, the usual. I was about to give him my usual spiel about turning off the parental locks when he cut me off. Have you? He muttered through deep, excited breaths. Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like? Now, that was far from the first prank call I'd ever gotten. My immediate response was to hang up and mutter to my coworker about the annoying pricks we got pranking us. I shoved the memory of that call out of my head for a solid week. We got all manner of weird calls, so one stupid one like that wasn't enough to faze me. But late on a Friday night, just before midnight, a familiar, breathy voice touched my ear. Have you ever wondered what human flesh tastes like? He asked. I do. All the? I ended the call before he got any further. Just my luck to get the creep calling a second time. I asked my coworker if he'd ever gotten a call like that before, but he only shrugged and said he hadn't. I really hoped that not engaging with the creep would be enough to get him to give up. 2 times wasn't too much to be concerned with anyway. But the third call was starting to get more personal, and I hate how well I remember it. The weirdest thing about that third call was how normal it started. Just a normal-sounding man asking about our company, how long we've been in business, what city we're based out of, and the cost of our plans. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then he whispered, "I want to know what the flesh of a pretty young girl tastes like." My mind reeled as I ended the call as quickly as possible. For prank caller, the guy was getting pretty tricky. And he was dedicated. I was almost starting to worry at that point. But then, I didn't hear from him for a while. I thought that maybe he'd given up, or had gotten bored, or whatever. I didn't care. I just wanted the creepy calls to stop. I wasn't going to complain when they did. For a month, I was in the clear. I was starting to forget the strange caller and his creepy desires. I was over it, and had gone back to being generally annoyed by our regular callers. I should have known better. A call came in one night, at nearly 1:45. It didn't even go to me. My co-worker, the only other person working at the time, got the call. "Hey." My co-worker called to me. "This guy is asking for you." I told him to pass the call to me, and I'd handle it. It wasn't the first time someone had dealt with me previously, and wanted to continue with the same representative. So I didn't think anything of it. "How can I help you this evening?" I mindlessly asked into the phone. "I want to know how your flesh tastes." The too familiar voice breathed in my ear. "I want to savor it on my tongue." "Leave me alone," I screamed into the phone. "Fucking stop." To my horror, the phantom voice laughed at my fury. He laughed and laughed until I ripped my headset off my head, and stormed away from my miniature cubicle, tapping my finger hard against the end call button as I left. Maybe it was because he finally got a reaction out of me, or maybe because he was getting worse. But the calls ramped up to at least once a day. I did everything I could to get him to leave me alone after that. I told my supervisors. I switched my ships. The company even called the police. Of course, they were never able to trace the call. But at least we tried. But my mystery caller kept calling. 2, 3, sometimes even 4 calls a day. Each time telling me how much he desired the taste of human flesh. Sometimes he mentioned my flesh. Sometimes he mentioned other people he wanted to eat. But it was always the same. He wanted to eat a human. After a month of that, I quit. No 2 weeks notice. No offers to try to stick it out. I went to sit at my desk one morning, and realized I couldn't put my headset on. I just couldn't handle it anymore. So I got up and went to my boss, and told him I was done. No one judged me for it. I probably stuck it out longer than they expected. I left with a glowing letter of recommendation, and mumbled words of apology that they couldn't do more. I spent a lot of time hiding out in my bedroom after I left the call center. After a couple weeks without getting a weird phone call, or having to talk to anyone really, I started going out again. Life started getting back to normal, and I stopped thinking about the weird caller during all my waking hours. While I hadn't forgot about the terrible calls, I was able to push them out of my head. I even lined up a job interview that I was supposed to go to yesterday. The job was nothing special, but it was a huge step for me. I was all set to go for that interview yesterday. My suit was ironed, my hair was styled, and I felt better than I had in months. I even found myself smiling while I was waiting for the bus to come pick me up. And then I heard it. It was nothing more than a whisper in my ear. Hot breath brushed over my skin as the bus approached. I know what flesh tastes like now. I spun hard as panic came over me. My eyes scanned the group of people moving toward the bus, but no one stood out from the crowd. My mysterious caller had found me, and worse, he'd gone through with his sick, twisted fantasy. I didn't get on the bus. How could I? He was on there, and he knows who I am. I skipped my interview and went right back to my bedroom. At least it's safe in here. But now, my cell phone keeps ringing. I won't answer it, no matter how long it rings. Because it's just safer to let it ring. This happened when Uber was still relatively new. My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year, and although originally from Australia, we had spent the last year traveling through some of the more shady parts of Europe. So we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi. Fortunately, I had Uber, and summoned a taxi as quick as possible. He arrived pretty quickly, got out, and took our bags. I didn't really think anything of it. However, I insisted I take my own bag, and tried to open the trunk. No, he snapped at me. I was startled, but I said, "Okay, I'll just sit with it on my lap." My husband and I traveled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise there won't be any room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking for is for him to do his job. I was already looking around to see if I could get another cab instead, because I really couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped, and basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't gotten the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I did. I never got into a taxi alone as a result of some kidnapping stories in Greece of a similar nature. So I waited, and I saw what was in his trunk. It wasn't all over the flooring, just on one side. I instantly felt ill. It looked like blood. The spot was wet, and I stared blankly, with the dim light. I could just make out various other stains, of similar, but darker colors. I barely began to process it all, until the suitcase was in, and the trunk door was slammed shut. I was now wide awake. I didn't want to get into the Uber. Everything was wrong. This was a mistake. "What's the holdup?" "Get in," the Uber guy yelled at us. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie, I would be screaming to myself, "Don't get in the cab." So I got into the Uber, with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around the corners, went sharply forward at brake slamming. I felt ill, and I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Was it real? Halfway through my haze, I realized this was not the way. I mean, far be it for me to tell the driver, in their own city, where the hell they're going. But I like to be prepared, and I like to know where I am. And he wasn't trying to mug us off, taking us the touristic scenic route. He was just going the wrong way. "You're going the wrong way." The words fell out of my mouth. The guy said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. "What?" my husband asked. "We're going the wrong way." "Are we going the wrong way?" my husband asked. "We are going the wrong way," I repeated. My husband is not one to take shit from anyone. "Hey man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying you anymore, so don't piss around, and take us where we're going to, or I'm calling the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out. I didn't care about the money. I just thought we were pawns in this crazed guy's master plan. We were going to swim with the fishes in the Hudson or something, because I was going crazy, and my mind was wandering. There was blood in the trunk. Thoughts rushed through my head. Perhaps he was taking us to some serial killer warehouse, with all his serial killer cab driver friends, to slaughter us. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. I'm pretty sure this isn't an Uber, I muttered to myself. But the cab driver spoke up. Do you see the sign? It is an Uber, he snapped. Then why don't you do your job? My husband snapped at him, without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought it was too much trouble. One loudmouth Aussie bogan and his crazy wife, because now he turned around and started going the right way. We got to the hotel, and I made sure to check the trunk again. But it was darker now, and I couldn't see anything clearly, except for lots of shredded rags, with a deep rust color staining them all. In the year 1972, my younger sister and I were forced to move from our home in Norway to go live in the UK. My mother had just married an English man who had 4 children of his own, and they were expecting another one. It was a miserable time for me, because at 6 years old, I had not begun school yet in Norway, so consequently I spoke no English. I had also been forced to leave my father and beloved grandparents behind, and my own mother was more interested in her new husband than any of her children. My childhood was the unhappiest time of my life, and this was only exasperated by the experiences in the manor house in which we moved to. The old manor house was situated in a seaside town. From the outside, it was the picture postcard of the British countryside. A large lawn surrounding the driveway leading to the house, a glass greenhouse, stables around the back, and horses in the paddock. But behind this facade, we experienced such horrors, some that I still struggle to talk about to this day. Us children all experienced paranormal activity, particularly at night, and it left us exhausted. Our parents were not particularly concerned and often shut us out. All we had were each other, and it was terrifying. You dreaded sleep, and the activity that would come with it. I would sleep with my dog and cat on the bed, but even they could not bring me enough comfort. One night, when I was around 9 years old, I was awoken by my dog standing near the bedroom window, growling. The cat was standing with her back arched and fur standing on end, hissing loudly. All of a sudden, though, my dog whimpered, and then suddenly there was silence. The room went cold, and the darkness seemed to engulf us. I got out of my bed shaking in fear, and crept towards my bedroom window, where my dog was now crouching, ears pinned down to her head. The floorboards creaked under my weight. As I reached the blacked-out curtains, I peeked out to see if there was an animal in the front yard that could have startled the cat or dog, but I saw nothing. I craned my neck and looked beyond the greenhouse. Again, there was nothing. I sighed. I took a step back and went to draw the curtain. But then, suddenly, everything happened at once. The dog started barking ferociously and frothing at the mouth, and my bedroom door swung open and slammed hard against the wall. My posters then flew off the walls. I turned back to the window and I saw the face of a man smiling menacingly at me. Terrified, I spun around expecting to see someone who stood behind me, but when I did, there was no one there. I turned back to the window, and it was gone. All that was left was the fog imprint from the outside of the window, as if someone had had their face pressed up against it when looking in. My room was on the 2nd floor, and no one could have reached that far without a ladder. Since that day, I have never forgotten that face. But the activity continued. I would wake up nearly every morning with my posters littered all over the floor and would spend the first part of my day pinning them back up. It was relentless. My parents never believed me, but after months of torment, I refused to leave my mother's bed at night. It was then when my stepfather was forced to sleep in my bedroom for a night, and only after he experienced it for himself did he believe me. When he woke up in the morning, all of my posters were laying skewed on top of him. Despite all of this, there was one thing that did bring me comfort during my miserable childhood. I always missed my family in Norway dearly and cried myself to sleep most nights. But then one night, I felt a light touch brush beside my hair from my face. This simple and intimate action brought me so much comfort. I opened my eyes and saw an older woman sitting beside me. She had gray hair swept back into a tight bun, and now reflecting on the clothes that she wore, I suspect that she was once a maid or the head of the house. After all, this was a very old large manor house. She would visit me often and always brought this feeling of familiarity and comfort. Although I knew that she wasn't alive like you or I did feel that she kept me safe from the man that I saw at my window. I was not the only child in that house to have a paranormal experience either. My younger sister Ella shared a room with our stepsister Marie, and she would awake nightly with fits of terror and sweat. And she would often come into my room and curl up in my bed, frightened with me. I only had a small single bed, and with a dog, cat and now her kittens, it became too much to have her in my bed with me. So one night, when the usual routine of night terrors and her crawling into my bed had occurred, I told her to go to our mother's bed instead, insisting that I would take her there. I held her hand, and we left my room and went on to the landing. My mother and stepfather's room was at the very end of the hallway, and right next to it, there was a very large Victorian mirror. We could see our reflections as we crept along the corridor and were careful not to wake up our sleeping siblings. Then suddenly, Ella stopped, frozen. I looked down at her and tugged her arm. Unresponsive, she stared ahead at the mirror. My heart sank, and I became overwhelmed with a feeling of dread. Slowly I looked up. There in the mirror, we saw the back of a maid pushing a service trolley. She was moving towards us. We bolted back to my room and hid under the quilt. We heard the squeak of wheels pass us and stop. We didn't dare to look, and we stayed there until morning. I will never forget these events. My parents used to live in a different house before I was born. It was a very old house, rather cold and drafty and creaky like most houses are. But one night, something very strange happened to my mother. My dad had gone out with his friends one evening, leaving my mother home alone. It was around 9:30, and my mom hears a car pull up into the driveway and sees the lights flashing into the house. She finds it very strange. It was a very early time for my dad to get home. She thought maybe he decided to come home early for some reason, but became more freaked out when the light to the laundry room, where the back door leads to, turned on by itself, and she swore she could see the outline of someone inside that room from underneath the door. It was at that moment that her cat started hissing and growling at the door, which was very unusual since she wouldn't hiss at anyone she didn't know. It was beginning to grow incredibly tense, and after a minute or so, my mom decided to open the door to see what was going on, only to find the room completely empty with the light on. The only way to turn on that light is from the inside of that room. She stood there confused, and then went to have a look at the car in the driveway as no one had opened the front door. There was no one there, and there was no way a car could have got out without making a sound. She still has no idea what it could have been. I used to work as a machine operator for a factory doing the graveyard shift. It was only me on the floor and a supervisor in the office, and for the most part, it was always a two-man shift. Sometimes, he would come to help me bring stock materials from the back. You see, the back storage room was haunted, or so I was told by the previous shift worker that I replaced. I'm not superstitious and was skeptical about what I was told, and for the first week, nothing unnatural happened, which of course only reinforced my skepticism. However, as time went by, I started to notice that the machines closest to the storage room entrance would turn on by themselves randomly. Not to mention that I started to hear people talking in the back storage room whilst I was passing. As I mentioned, it was only me and my supervisor on that shift, and when we would go to investigate after hearing, we would find everything dark and silent. The time that crowns all instances, though, happened a few months later. My supervisor had just finished helping me with a task, and he told me that he would be in the office if I needed him. I'm carrying on with my work, when about 20 minutes later, I hear a colossal crashing noise from the back storage room. It scared the shit out of me. At first, I assumed that it must have been him in the back room and that he crashed the forklift into the wall. But when I went to call him, he was already walking towards me and demanded to know what the noise was, because he was in his office at the time and assumed it was me. I told him that I had been in there the whole time, and that I thought it had been him who had made the noise. We were both visibly shaken, and mutually agreed to check it out. Like previous instances, the back storage lights were off and it was eerie quiet. We turned the lights on, and then we saw barrels toppled over and a broken crate with stock materials all over the ground. These crates were on shelves about 5 feet off the ground, and the barrels are completely full and very difficult to move. We cleaned it up, and he used a forklift to put the replacement crate with the materials back on the shelf. In the time it took us to fix up the mess, it was lunch break. He went out to get food, and I was alone operating the machines again, in this big factory the size of 2 football fields. I wasn't troubled or scared knowing that he would be back in about half an hour, but as the minutes ticked by, I kept hearing something. It sounded like a woman whispering, and it was coming directly from the dark back room. I tried putting it off, and thinking that it was in my head, and then I heard something. It sounded like a barrel had fallen down again by itself. I need to clarify, these barrels are very, very heavy, and they cannot fall down independently without a great deal of force pushing them. When I went to investigate, I saw a barrel in the middle of the room, and I booked it out of there. When he got back, he asked me what I was doing outside, and I told him that I kept hearing some strange whispering from the dark room, and when I went to investigate, I found a barrel had managed to roll itself to the middle of the room, and it had utterly terrified me. He didn't believe me, and thought that I was playing a practical joke on him, but the security camera however verified that the barrel just rolled out by itself from the dark storage area, which defies explanation. You can also clearly see me coming into view to check out where the barrel came from, and hurry back after turning off the machines. This prompted management to abolish the graveyard shift, and I quit shortly after. I was 10 years old, and just started 5th grade. I had made a new friend in school, Janie. My parents allowed me to go for a sleepover at her house, even though they'd only met her mother once, and my mom and dad were pretty laid back, because I was their last child, and my sisters were 9 and 13 years older than me. So my mom dropped me off, said hello to Janie's mom, and left. Me and Janie started playing karaoke, when her mom decided that she was going to leave. She said goodbye to us, gave us kisses on the cheek, and I remember that she smelled a bit like black licorice. Me and Janie were left to do whatever we wanted for the next 5 hours. Janie's older sister came home around 1 a.m. and told us that we should be going to bed because we were falling asleep on the couch. And so we went into Janie's room and laid in her bed. Later that night, I can't be sure what time it was because it was pitch black, but Janie's mom came home. I woke up to a pounding sound on Janie's bedroom door. I started yelling in fear when I felt a hand cover my mouth. It was Janie telling me to be quiet and pretend to be asleep. But at that moment, it was too late. Her mother had kicked in the door. She stormed over to the bed and grabbed Janie's face. She began screaming at Janie because we accidentally left the TV on. I was trying to hide under the covers, but she saw me, and she began slamming her fists on the bed around me and screamed, "You think you're better than me," over and over. I was sobbing and all I could think about was going home. I was so scared and I begged her mom to let me call my parents because I felt sick. Her mom, though, grabbed my chin, looked me in the eyes and said, "I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can." She stormed out of the room, slamming the half-broken bedroom door behind her. Janie said nothing and neither did I. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night. And in the morning, when I went to call my mother, Janie's mother was on the phone. She wouldn't let me use it even though I asked multiple times. And finally, when she was going to take a shower, I heard her pass the phone over to Janie's sister and said, "Don't let that little bitch use this phone. If you do, I ain't buying you cigarettes anymore." I was a sheltered kid, and at the time I overheard that, I knew that I had to get out of there. I approached Janie's sister, and she basically threw the phone at me. She was ready to give it to me before I even asked for it, and with a look of fear in her eyes she said, "My mom is calling her guy, so you need to call home now." And so I did. She saved my life, and I still believe it to this day. Was her guy someone who was going to come and get rid of me? I shudder at the thought. The rest of the story isn't very exciting. My mother picked me up and I acted like nothing was wrong. 2 days later, though, it was Parents' Day. Janie was in my class, which meant her mother was there as well. Her mother approached me and asked me why I never wanted to come over anymore, and she accused me of being a mean girl. She was talking to me in a way that seemed harmless, therefore was obvious to my mom or teacher. I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. But 2 weeks later, my oldest sister was babysitting me whilst our parents were at the movies, and I broke down and told her what happened because I couldn't stop thinking about it. She comforted me and told my parents. We hugged each other and cried. A couple of weeks later, Janie stopped coming to school. My classmates wondered what happened, and so did I. I didn't want to ask my parents what happened. 15 years later, I heard from Janie on Facebook. There was no life-changing conversation, but we did exchange pleasantries. I suppose that's life sometimes. So crazy, alcoholic, abusive mother. Let's never meet again. I was working in the third largest building on this planet for floor space. It was around 3 a.m. on a Sunday, and I was walking down an aisle in the middle of my department. At this time, the place was very nearly vacant, as it was a holiday weekend, and we had only myself and a skeleton crew of maintenance workers under my direction working in another department, all of whom were males. As I'm walking by my office on the plant floor, the power goes out, and the plant drops into the most absolute darkness that I have ever experienced. With the power gone, I hear the various machines spinning down to rest, and the silence becomes overwhelming relative to the background noise that I had gotten used to. The faint sounds of running water become evident in the moments after the blackout, whilst I began searching my pockets for my phone and the flashlight that it offered. As my hand found the phone, a scream erupted from somewhere nearby, muffled and distant. It was the kind of scream that you hear from a 5-year-old girl in her first haunted house, as the bloody clown steps around the corner and fires up the chainsaw. It startled me very badly, and I immediately dropped my phone onto the ground. The scream continued, a constantly fading note that seemed to be moving away from my position. Panicked and terrified, I fumbled around the dirty floor for my phone and found it seconds before the emergency lights lit the plant with the eerie glow of yellow light. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I looked around me, muscles tense and ready to defend against whatever this was. I tried my radio a couple of times before I realized that with the power outage, the digital frequencies were useless without the receivers up in the main office. I started to move through the various production lines to where I assumed the scream had originated. My mind was working furiously. I had no women in my crew tonight, and we were the only people allowed in the plant. So where had the scream come from? Details began to press into my mind that I had not noticed before. The apparent youth of the voice behind the scream made no sense, and it was a scream of pain, the kind that you cannot even attempt to control. It had faded away from my position gradually and then trailed off as if she had run out of breath. As I stepped between two products on one of the final assembly lines before a wide open space in the next apartment, the emergency lights dimmed and the audible electricity buzz filled the space around me. Struggling to understand what was happening, my senses were again knocked askew when the normal plant lights blazed to life. This left spots across my vision for a moment, forcing me to raise my hand to shield my eyes. As the shadow crossed my vision, I saw it. Or rather, I saw her, only for that moment. She stood there, hand outstretched towards me, a vague outline, partially hidden behind one of our products. Dark features were the only distinguishable characteristic that I can remember, as my reflex in that moment had been to blink against the bright lights, and after that, she was gone. To this day, I have no idea if what I saw was real, or if I had imagined it. No tales are told of the mysterious young woman in the repair hall, not by anyone but myself. No one knows of any deaths matching to her description in the area, or ghosts known to haunt the plant. Not a soul had heard her scream in the darkness, not before, during, or after those black pre-dawn minutes. Believe me, I've tried to find someone, anyone with information that might explain what I saw, but all to no avail. I'm left wandering with a memory more crisp than any photograph I've ever seen of that young woman standing in the distance, her arm outstretched towards me. Needless to say, I did not revisit the same location of the event, ever, because nopes don't get any bigger than that. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.